The gunshot cracked open the Nebraska night like a bone snapping. Clara Marsh stood on the cabin porch with her dead husband's rifle pressed against her shoulder, the barrel still smoking, pointed at nothing and everything at once. The echo rolled out across the prairie and kept going, dissolving into the dark, the way water disappears into dry earth, leaving no trace of itself behind. She had not fired at the shadow. She had fired above it. There was a difference, and she knew the difference, and that knowing told her more about herself than she had wanted to know on a Wednesday night in November. "I have seen you 3 nights running," she said, her voice carrying no shake in it, no tremor, no apology. This was a warning. "The 4th night I won't aim high." Silence answered her. Not the ordinary silence of the prairie, which was never truly silent at all, always carrying the sound of wind through grass, and the distant complaint of coyotes, and the low conversation of the creek somewhere in the dark. This was a different kind of silence. The kind that meant something was listening. Then the footsteps moved away. Deliberate, unhurried. The sound of a large man who had decided to leave, not a large man who had been frightened into leaving. There was a difference there, too, and Clara noted it the way she noted everything, now cataloging the world around her with the precise, exhausted attention of someone who understood that survival lived in the details. She stood on that porch until the footsteps were gone, and the ordinary sounds of the night returned to fill the space where they had been. The wind, the creek, the soft complaint of her 3 remaining chickens shifting in their sleep inside the lean-to. Then she went inside, set the rifle against the wall beside the door exactly where Owen had always kept it, and sat down at the kitchen table in the dark. She did not light the lamp. There was something about darkness that felt honest lately. The lamp made shadows, and shadows made shapes, and shapes made her think she saw things in the corners of the room that were not there. In the dark, at least, everything was equally invisible. At least in the dark she was not fooling herself about what she could and could not see. Owen had been dead for 4 months and 3 days. She had counted every one of them. Not from grief exactly, though grief was present, a dull and persistent weight lodged somewhere beneath her sternum that she had grown so accustomed to, she sometimes forgot it was not simply part of her anatomy. She had counted the days because counting was something to do, because the days kept arriving whether she was prepared for them or not, and counting them felt like the minimum acknowledgement she could offer to the fact that time was still moving, even when she felt like she was standing perfectly still inside it. Owen Marsh had been a decent man. She believed that. She had believed it when she married him at 22 in her mother's parlor in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and she believed it now sitting in the dark in the cabin he had built with his own hands on a piece of Nebraska prairie that had looked the first time she saw it like the loneliest place on the surface of the earth. It had looked like the loneliest place on earth, and she had thought standing there in the summer heat with dust on her shoes and Owen beside her talking about crop rotation that she could learn to love it. She had been right about that. She had learned to love the land, the vast, indifferent, beautiful land that did not care what she felt about it, that simply continued being itself in all weather and all seasons, reliable in its wildness in a way that people rarely were. What she had not entirely figured out in the 4 years of their marriage was whether she had learned to love Owen, or whether she had learned to love the life that Owen represented, which was a different thing and a more complicated one. He had not been a bad husband. He had worked hard and kept his word, and been kind to her in the steady, undemonstrative way of men who show affection through action rather than speech. He had built the good stone fireplace she was sitting in front of right now because she had mentioned once in passing that she was afraid of the cold. He had planted the cottonwood seedlings along the east fence because she had said she missed trees. He had listened even when she had not known she was speaking. But there were things Owen had not told her. She knew that now with a certainty that sat differently than grief, that had edges where grief was only heaviness. There were things in the drawer of Owen's writing desk that she had found 3 weeks after the funeral, sorting through his papers with the methodical determination of a woman who was not going to let herself fall apart when there was practical work to be done. A bundle of letters tied with a strip of rawhide addressed to Owen in a hand she did not recognize. The handwriting was deliberate and careful, the hand of someone who had taught himself to write rather than been formally taught, each letter formed with a slight excess of care that spoke of hard-won skill. The letters were signed only with the initial R. She had not read them that day. She had untied the rawhide, seen the first few lines of the topmost letter, understood that whatever was in these pages was going to require more from her than she had available in that moment, and tied them back up again and put them in the drawer. That had been 6 weeks ago. The letters were still in the drawer. Clara was not yet sure what she was waiting for. She suspected she was waiting to become the kind of person who could read them without losing something she could not afford to lose. The fire had burned down to coals. She watched the orange light pulse and dim like something breathing. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would deal with whatever was in those letters. She told herself that every night. She had not yet been ready on any of the nights that followed. Outside, the prairie had returned to its ordinary darkness. Whatever large thing had stood at the edge of her property and watched her window for 3 consecutive nights was gone for now. Clara sat at her table and listened to the silence and thought about the way the footsteps had receded, unhurried, calm, not frightened. That was the part she kept returning to. A person who fires a rifle in the dark at you should frighten you at least a little, should introduce some small degree of urgency into your departure. The thing in the dark had left at exactly the pace it had chosen, and that pace was the pace of someone who had decided to leave, not someone who had been driven away. She was not sure whether that should comfort her or alarm her. She thought it was probably both. She went to bed without lighting the lamp, and she lay in the dark listening to the wind, and at some point between that and morning she slept. Morning came gray and cold, the sky the color of old pewter, the grass outside silver with frost. Clara built the fire up from the coals before she did anything else, standing in her nightgown with sleep still at the corners of her eyes, feeding kindling into the hearth until the flames were steady enough to trust. Then she dressed, pulled on her coat and boots, took up the rifle, and went outside. She had not been looking for anything specific. She had told herself she was checking on the chickens and assessing whether the water in the trough had frozen over in the night. These were legitimate morning tasks. They were not pretexts for anything. But she found herself standing at the edge of the porch, looking out across the yard, and then stepping down off the porch and walking in the direction the footsteps had gone the night before. The frost held tracks well. She could see where he had stood, the impressions deep and clear in the silvered grass, and she followed them with her eyes toward the cottonwood fence line. She was not following them with her feet. She was simply observing. Then she saw what was at the base of the steps. She had not seen it in the dark when she went back inside. She had been looking out, not down, which was the kind of mistake you made when your mind was focused on what was leaving rather than on what had been left. It sat on the second porch step, placed with a precision that suggested intention rather than accident. A trap. An iron leg-hold trap of the kind used for medium-sized game, the jaws open and set and ready to close on whatever weight triggered the pressure plate. Clara stood and looked at it for a long moment. It had not been there yesterday morning. She would have seen it. She was meticulous about the area immediately around the cabin, checking it habitually the way Owen had taught her, because out here the things you didn't notice were the things that could hurt you. She crouched down and studied it without touching it. The metal was familiar, not in the way of something she owned, but in the way of something she had seen before in a different context. The jaw style, the particular shape of the pressure plate. She had seen this style of trap at Frank Dooley's equipment store. He stocked them specifically, had made a point of showing Owen one 2 summers ago when they had come in for seed. She remembered because Owen had declined to purchase it, said he preferred snares for small game, and Frank had made a brief and quickly suppressed expression of contempt that Clara had filed away in the part of her mind that kept records of such things. This was not Owen's trap, not Clara's trap. It had been placed deliberately on the path between the cabin door and the outhouse, on a route Clara walked every evening after dark and every morning before full light. If she had not seen it, if her foot had come down on that pressure plate in the dark, she sat back on her heels and let the full weight of that settle over her. Someone had placed this trap on her property with the intention of injuring her, not killing her. A leg-hold trap at this size would not kill a person. It would break bone, tear tissue, pin a person to the ground in pain, alone in the dark, far from any help. She thought about the figure at the edge of her property. She thought about the unhurried footsteps that had circled her cabin 3 nights running. She thought about the fact that the trap had been placed on the porch step and set, and yet the jaws were now not closed, not triggered, open. Someone had disarmed it and moved it to where she would see it in daylight, not removed it entirely. Left it here, visible, legible, like a message written in a language she could read. The shadow in the dark had not placed this trap. The shadow in the dark had found it and wanted her to know it existed. Clara stood up slowly, her knees aching in the cold, and stood for a moment looking out across the frost-pale prairie toward the tree line along Willow Creek. Her breath made small clouds in the cold air. She picked up the trap with both hands, feeling its weight, and carried it inside. She sat at the kitchen table, the trap in front of her, and she finally opened Owen's desk drawer, and she took out the bundle of letters, and she untied the rawhide. She realized, ready now. The letters were dated across 3 years, the earliest from the summer of 1879, the most recent from the spring of 1881. They were not long letters. The writer was not a man who used words carelessly or in excess. Each letter covered exactly what it needed to cover and stopped. The first 3 letters were about work. Someone named R had worked for Owen during the summer of 1879, helping clear the east pasture and build the fence line. The tone was businesslike and spare, and told her little about the writer beyond his competence and his disinclination toward small talk. The 4th letter was different. It was dated October 1879, and it began without preamble. "You need to know what I saw in August. I have thought for 2 months about whether to write this, and I have decided you would want to know because you are not the kind of man who does business on a false foundation, even if knowing the truth makes things harder for you. Frank Dooley pressured the Kesho family into selling their east parcel in July. I was present for part of it. He had men divert the water from their irrigation channel 3 weeks before harvest. When their crop failed, he offered to buy the land for a price that was not fair. They were left without resources to survive the winter, and they had children. They sold. I witnessed the diversion of the water channel. I can testify to that if it ever becomes necessary. I am writing this so that there is a record in a place other than my own memory." Clara read the letter twice. Then she kept reading. The subsequent letters built the picture carefully, the way someone who is methodical by nature builds anything one piece at a time, each piece supporting the next. R had continued to observe Frank Dooley's acquisition of land in the following years. He had documented 3 more incidents of the kind described in the first letter. He had noted that the northeastern portion of what was now Owen's property, the pasture along the ridge, shared a boundary with land that had originally been part of the Apache family's holding, acquired through a process that R described in plain, careful language as coercion. The final letter from 1881 was the shortest. "I am leaving this area for a time. I wanted you to have these accounts before I go. If anything happens to the land or to you or to any claim against the property, these letters are a record. Keep them somewhere safe. You know where to find me if it becomes necessary." Below that, the single initial, R. Clara folded the letters and held them in her hands and sat for a while with what she now knew. Owen had known. He had known for 4 years that the edge of their property touched land that had been taken dishonestly, and he had kept the record of it, but had not acted on it, had not told her, had lived with the knowledge the way people sometimes live with things that are true and uncomfortable and not yet urgent. She did not know how to feel about that. She was not sure she needed to feel any particular way about it right now. Owen was in the ground behind the chapel in Harlan's Crossing, and his feelings about his own choices were no longer available for consultation. What she knew was this: the trap on her porch step bore the mark of Dooley's equipment. Someone named R knew about that land and had been watching this property, and last night a large figure had walked the perimeter of her home in the dark and had disarmed a trap that would have broken her leg. She looked at the trap on the table and at the letters in her hands and understood that these 2 things were connected. And then she went to see Agnes Pruitt. Agnes Pruitt was 68 years old, and had been on the Nebraska frontier for 30 of those years, and had the kind of face that resulted from 3 decades of weather and hard work and the exercise of strong opinions. She was not a comfortable woman to be around if you preferred to be agreed with. She was the most comfortable woman in the county to be around if you needed someone to tell you the truth. She opened her door before Clara had finished knocking, which meant she had seen her coming up the road, which meant she had been watching for her, which meant she already knew something. "Come in," Agnes said. "Coffee is hot." They sat across the kitchen table from each other, and Clara put the trap on the table between them, and Agnes looked at it with the calm attention of someone who had been expecting something of this nature. "Dooley's," Clara said. "I recognize the jaw style. Owen pointed it out to me 2 years ago." Agnes nodded once. "It was placed on my porch step, set and ready. Someone found it and disarmed it before I did." Agnes looked up from the trap and looked at Clara with those gray eyes that had seen 30 years of prairie and did not find much occasion for surprise anymore. "There is a man sleeping in the abandoned hay barn down by Willow Creek," Agnes said. "Lyle knows about him and hasn't moved on it yet. I don't believe he's dangerous. What I believe is that he's been watching your property." "Who is he?" Agnes wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "His name is River Cord. He worked for Owen in the summer of 1879. Half Irish, half Chiricahua Apache. He's been coming back to this area every couple of years since then, never staying long, staying out of the way of people who would make his presence into a problem." She paused. "He was fond of Owen. Owen was fair to him when fair was not a common offering." Clara thought about the letters tied with rawhide. She thought about the careful, deliberate handwriting of someone who had taught himself to write rather than been taught. R. "He left Owen letters," Clara said, "about the Dooley land situation, about what he witnessed." Agnes was quiet for a moment. "Then he knows things that Frank Dooley would prefer remained unknown." "Yes. And Frank knows that River is back." The two women looked at each other across the table. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods along the road with a sound like distant water. "The trap," Clara said. "Yes," Agnes said. "The trap." Clara picked up the iron trap and felt the weight of it, and thought about Frank Dooley's store, and Frank Dooley's equipment, and Frank Dooley's smooth and practiced courtesy, and the way his eyes had not been smiling when she had declined to sell him her land. "I need to talk to this man," she said. Agnes looked at her steadily. "I thought you might." "Will you tell me where to find him?" Agnes told her. The hay barn at the south end of Willow Creek had not been used in at least 3 years. Clara could tell by the state of the fence line running beside it and the way the door had warped in its frame from seasons of neglect. The original owner of the property had gone back east with what remained of his family in 1881, of the ones who had found out that the land did not care about their dreams and was not going to be converted to their purposes by determination alone. Clara walked the half-mile from the road with the rifle over her arm and the morning's frost still on the grass, her breath making small white shapes in the cold air that dissolved as quickly as they formed. She found River Cord outside. That was the first thing she noted. Not inside the barn, not concealed, not hiding. He was sitting on the ground with his back against the weathered exterior wall legs, stretched out in front of him, working a piece of deer hide through his hands with the steady, repetitive motion of someone engaged in familiar work. He looked up when she was still 30 yards out, which told her either he had seen her coming earlier and had not moved, or he had heard her approaching at a distance that should have been too far for ordinary hearing. She kept walking until she was close enough to see his face clearly. She had formed an impression of him in the dark 3 nights of impressions built from shadows and the sound of footsteps and one glimpse of an enormous silhouette. The reality was different from the impression and also larger than it in the way that people who are reduced to shadows by distance or darkness are always larger when they become specific. He was very tall, taller than Owen had been, taller than any man she was accustomed to seeing around Harlan's Crossing, with the kind of build that spoke not of bulk, but of the dense, functional musculature of someone who had spent their life doing physical work in all conditions. His hair was dark and pulled back simply. His face was angular and still, and held the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have learned to observe without being observed, who have made a habit of knowing what is around them at all times. He was watching her with dark eyes that gave away nothing and waited for whatever she was going to do next. She stopped 6 feet away and looked at him. He looked back at her and continued working the deer hide through his hands. Clara reached into her coat and took out the iron trap and set it on the ground in front of him. She did not say anything. She watched his eyes go to the trap and then come back to her. "The path between your cabin door and the outhouse," he said. "It was set in the grass beside the third post. You found it 2 nights ago, before I walked the perimeter." She had not expected that. The information rearranged things. He had found the trap on his first night circling the property, and he had removed it, and he had said nothing, and he had come back 2 more nights. She turned that over in her mind, looking at its different sides. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. He looked at her with an expression that was not quite patience but was adjacent to it. "You fired a rifle at me the 3rd night. The first 2 nights I was trying to determine whether you would shoot first and then decide what you'd shot at, or whether you would take a moment to consider the situation. And on the third night I concluded that you would take a moment to consider the situation." Clara looked at him. He looked back at her. The prairie wind moved between them, cold and smelling of frost and distance. "You worked for my husband," she said. A brief pause. Something shifted in his face very slightly, in the way a surface shifts when something passes below it. "Yes, summer of 1879. "He kept your letters." River Cord set the deer hide down on his knee and gave her his full attention for the first time since she had arrived, which was a subtle change but a real one. He had been attending to her fully from the moment she appeared on the road. Now he was attending to her differently. "He told me to write things down," River said after a moment. "He said that things you don't write down have a way of not existing when you need them to exist." That sounds like Owen. He was careful that way, about the things that mattered to him. Clara looked out at the creek for a moment. The water was low but still moving a thin, dark line through the frost-pale grass. "Frank Dooley's name is in those letters?" "Yes." "Frank Dooley's trap was on my porch step?" "Yes." "And you have been watching my property for 3 nights without explaining yourself to me?" River was quiet for a moment. Then, "Your husband worked that land for 4 years. He knew what he knew, and he kept the record of it, but he did not act on it. I have thought for a long time about why he didn't act. I think he was waiting for the right moment, and then the right moment ran out on him." He looked at the deer hide in his hands. "I came back when I heard he had died because I thought someone should know what is in those letters. Someone who lives on that land and might need to know." He paused again. "I was trying to determine whether you were the kind of person who could use that information or whether it would only frighten you." "And the trap," Clara said. "What did the trap tell you?" He looked at her steadily. "That someone wants you frightened enough to leave, which means there is something worth wanting you to leave for." Clara picked up the iron trap from the ground and held its weight in both hands. It was heavier than it looked, or perhaps it simply felt heavier with the full understanding of what it had been placed there to do. "It's Dooley's equipment," she said. "I recognize the jaw style." River nodded once. "Do you know why he wants the land?" "Not the general shape of it. The specific reason now. There is a survey going through next spring. A railway survey. The route they are considering runs through the eastern edge of this county." He said it plainly, without drama, the way he said everything. "Land that is currently grassland worth a few dollars an acre becomes worth a great deal more once a railway station appears within 3 miles of it. Frank Dooley has been positioning himself for 2 years." Clara stood with the trap in her hands and let that settle. The eastern pasture, the ridge land. The parcel along the boundary that had once been part of the Apache family's holding acquired the way Frank Dooley acquired things. "He needs my land to consolidate the parcel," she said, not a question, working it through out loud. "Yes. and he would prefer to acquire it before the survey makes its intentions public and the price becomes something he can't afford. Yes, she set the trap down. The morning sun had come far enough over the horizon to lay pale gold across the frost-pale grass, and the whole world looked clean and cold and indifferent the way it always did out here, the way it had from the first morning she had woken up in this county and looked out at it and understood that it did not know she was here and did not care, and that this was, in its way, a relief. "You grew up between two worlds," she said, and then felt the bluntness of it and thought about taking it back. He didn't react as though it had landed badly. He simply considered the statement the way he considered everything, with the same deliberate attention. "I grew up knowing both worlds," he said, "which is different from belonging to either one. Your mother was Irish. Margaret Cord, from County Clare originally. She came over in 1845 during the famine." A pause. "She was not easily defeated. And your father?" "Seeks the storm, Chiricahua Apache. He was a good man, patient." Something in his voice very slight. "He did not survive the change in how the Army conducted its business in Arizona in '71. Clara looked at him. He was looking at the creek. She thought about what it would mean to carry that. The specific quality of losing a parent to violence, dressed up as policy, dressed up as progress, dressed up as the forward motion of civilization. She thought about the particular weight of a loss that came with someone else's justification already attached to it. "Owen mentioned you," she said. She had not planned to say that. It arrived of its own accord, offered itself as something she could give him. River looked at her. Not often. He was not a man who talked about people extensively. But once the summer before he died, we were talking about the fence line on the east pasture and whether to extend it, and he said that the man who had helped him build the original fence had taught him that post depth mattered more than post spacing. She paused. He said it like he was quoting someone he respected. River was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the grass around them, the dry winter grass making its particular sound like something being carefully turned over. "He was a fair man," River said finally. "He was." Clara looked at the ground. "He was also a man who kept things from me that I needed to know. I am still deciding how I feel about that." "Those are not contradictory things." "No," she said, "they are not." They stood in the cold morning air, not quite side by side, the barn behind him, and the wide open land in front of them both. And the silence between them was not the silence of two people who had nothing to say, but the silence of two people who were paying attention to what had just been said. After a while, Clara picked up the trap again. "I'm going to take this to Agnes Pruitt. She will know whether it can be used as evidence of anything." "Agnes Pruitt is a careful woman," River said. "She will know what to do with it. She told me where to find you." "I know." A pause. "She came by yesterday morning, said she thought I should stop circling the property in the dark and have a conversation instead." Clara almost smiled at that. Agnes was exactly that direct, and it was exactly what she would have done. "She said she doesn't think you're dangerous. She is a good judge of character." "She usually is." Clara turned to go. She had taken 3 steps when she stopped and turned back. Something had been sitting in the back of her mind since she had arrived, and she had not yet given it words, and she decided to give it words now because she was 4 months past the point in her life where she was going to let the important things go unsaid because the moment felt awkward. "Why did you come back?" she said. Not the official answer, not the letters and the land and the railway survey, the real answer. River Cord looked at her for a long, quiet moment. The sunlight was fully up now, pale and cold but present, laying itself across the ground and across his face, and making him specific in the way that daylight makes everything specific, every detail clear and unambiguous. "Owen wrote to me when he got sick," he said. "He wrote 1 letter. He said he was not going to recover, and that he was afraid the land would be taken, and that Clara would not know until it was too late to fight it." He paused. "He said she is stronger than she knows and she will figure it out on her own, but if you happen to be in the area, keep an eye on things." Clara stood with the iron trap in her hands and the cold wind on her face, and let that settle into her chest and sit there. Owen, in the last weeks of his life, had written to a man he had worked alongside for one summer 4 years ago and asked him to watch over his wife. Not because Clara needed watching over, because Owen had understood at the end the specific loneliness of facing a fight you did not know was coming, and he had done what he could from where he was with what he had left. She looked at the trap in her hands. She looked at River Cord standing in front of his borrowed barn with the winter sun on his face. "He could have told me himself," she said, and heard the small break in her own voice that she had not planned for. "Yes," River said simply. "He could have." There was nothing to add to that. It was the truth, and it had the clean, uncushioned quality of truth, and she was not going to pretend that it did not hurt. But it was not the only truth. It sat beside another truth, which was that Owen had also, in his own constrained and imperfect way, tried to protect her. That two things could be true at the same time was not a new idea. It was simply one she had to keep learning. "Don't stop watching the property," she said. She turned and walked back toward the road with the trap heavy in her hands, and she did not look back, but she was aware with a certainty she could not fully account for that he watched her until she was out of sight. That evening she sat at the kitchen table with the letters spread out in front of her, and Agnes Pruitt's voice from that morning still in her ears. She thought about Frank Dooley's smooth courtesy and his equipment markings and the specific cruelty of a trap designed not to kill, but to leave a woman alone and injured in the dark. She thought about River Cord's deliberate handwriting and his deliberate way of speaking and the way he had said Owen was a fair man, with the careful tone of someone measuring exactly how much weight to put on each word. She thought about Owen's last letter written to a man he trusted, asking him to watch over things. Outside, the night was settling over the prairie in its usual way, the light draining out of the sky in slow stages, the darkness coming on not all at once but in layers. Clara watched it through the window above the kitchen table and thought about the fact that tomorrow morning she was going to ride into Harlan's Crossing and pay a visit to Tobias Green at his law office on the main street. She thought about the letters and the trap and the railway survey that River had mentioned, and the eastern pasture where the boundary ran along the ridge. She thought about Owen's careful record-keeping, his instinct to preserve the evidence of things even when he was not yet ready to use it. She thought about the way he had planted cottonwood seedlings along the east fence because she had said she missed trees, about the way he had listened even when she had not known she was speaking. She took the bundle of letters and tied them back up with the rawhide strip and held them in both hands for a moment, feeling their weight. Then she opened the drawer of his writing desk and placed them inside carefully and closed the drawer again. She got up from the table and went to the window and stood looking out at the dark. She could not see anything. That was the nature of dark. But she understood, standing at that window with her hands loose at her sides and the firelight behind her, that the dark was not empty. It was full of things that were present without being visible, and not all of those things were threats. Some of them were simply there, patient, waiting for the morning to make them legible. She turned away from the window. She had a great deal to do. Tobias Green's law office occupied the narrow space between the feed store and the barber on Harlan's Crossing's main street, pressed in on both sides with the particular modesty of a man who understood that the law in a town this size was most effective when it did not announce itself. The sign above the door was painted in letters small enough that you had to be looking for it to find it. The office smelled of lamp oil and old paper, and the specific dusty permanence of documents that had been written to outlast the people who created them, and in Clara's experience usually did. Tobias himself was 50 years old and carried in his face the expression of a man who had spent his career watching people arrive at decisions they could not reverse. He was not a hard man. He was simply a realistic one in the way that long familiarity with human error tends to produce, and he had the patience of someone who had learned that most people, given enough time and enough pressure, would eventually tell him what he needed to know. He looked up when Clara came through the door, and she saw the brief recalibration that happened in people's faces when they saw her now, the small adjustment from whatever they had been thinking to the awareness that they were looking at Owen Marsh's widow, and that Owen Marsh's widow was a matter requiring careful handling. She had grown deeply specifically tired of being handled carefully. It felt like being held at a distance by people who were using concern as a substitute for honesty, and she had decided sometime in the second month after Owen's death that she was done with it. She sat down across from his desk without waiting to be invited and placed the bundle of letters in front of him. "I need you to read these," she said, "and tell me what they mean for the property title." Tobias looked at the letters. He looked at her. He reached for the bundle and untied the rawhide strip with careful fingers and spread the letters out before him and began to read with the focused, unhurried attention of a man who understood that documents should not be rushed. Clara sat in the chair across from him and looked through the narrow window at the street outside and let the time pass without trying to fill it. Outside Harlan's Crossing was conducting its ordinary Tuesday business. Two men from the grain cooperative were talking in front of the feed store with the body language of men discussing prices rather than people. A woman Clara recognized vaguely from Sunday services was crossing the street with a market basket. The town was proceeding in its habitual way, indifferent to what was happening inside Tobias Green's office, indifferent to the weight of what was written on those carefully preserved pages. Tobias read without expression. When he finished, he aligned the letters with the precise attention of a man who believed order was a form of respect, and set them down on the desk between them. "These are significant documents," he said. "I know they are significant. I need to understand specifically how significant and specifically for what purpose." He leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under him, and looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing what kind of conversation he was in. The account of the Kesho land transaction in July of 1879 establishes a documented pattern in Frank Dooley's acquisition practices. The water diversion is described in enough detail with enough specificity about dates and locations that a corroborating witness could turn this from allegation into actionable evidence. He paused. The subsequent letters build on that foundation. Taken together, they suggest that several of Dooley's boundary claims in this county rest on a foundation that would not survive serious scrutiny, including the northeastern boundary of my property. Again, the slight recalibration in his expression. "You know about the title challenge. I know Frank sent surveyors onto my land without permission last week, citing a boundary dispute. I know there is a railway survey coming through this county next spring. I know that the eastern pasture and the ridge land become worth substantially more once that survey route becomes public knowledge." She looked at him steadily. "What I need to know is whether these letters and the man who wrote them are sufficient to counter whatever legal mechanism Frank is preparing to use." Tobias was quiet for a moment. He tapped the edge of the letter stack twice with two fingers. "The man who wrote these, is he available to appear as a witness?" "He is in the area and has agreed to provide an affidavit." "He would need to sign that affidavit in front of me. Potentially appear at a county hearing if Dooley pursues the title challenge through formal channels." He paused, and she heard in the pause the weight of what he was not quite saying. "You understand the complications involved in presenting testimony from a man of his particular background before a county proceeding in 1883. "I understand the complications. I am asking you whether the testimony would be legally sufficient if he provides it." Tobias considered that for a moment with the care of a man who took precision seriously. Combined with these letters, the original survey records from the county office, and this witness's direct account of what he observed in July of 1879, yes, I believe it would be sufficient to establish that Frank Dooley's boundary claims in the northeast quadrant of this county were built on a process that does not hold up under examination. He picked up the letter bundle again and held it. "This is meticulous work. Whoever wrote these was thinking a long way ahead." Clara stood up. "Keep those letters in your safe. Not your desk drawer. Your safe." She looked at him. "And Tobias, Owen came to see you before he died." The recalibration in his face was more pronounced this time. He set the letters down slowly. "He came to ask you to do something with the property title," she said. It was not a question. Tobias looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man deciding whether the person across from him is ready for what he is about to say. Then he opened the bottom drawer of his desk and removed a separate document folded precisely in thirds and placed it on the desk between them. 3 weeks before he died, Tobias said, Owen Marsh came to this office and asked me to prepare a full and unconditional transfer of the property title into your name. Sole ownership independent of any subsequent claim or challenge with 2 witnesses whose names are on the document. He set his hands flat on the desk. I completed the transfer while Owen was still alive. He signed it. The witnesses signed it. It has been sitting in my safe since the day he died. He paused. I have been waiting for the right moment to tell you. I was not certain how much you already knew or how much you were prepared to receive. Clara looked at the folded document on the desk. She did not reach for it immediately. She sat with the weight of what it represented, which was Owen in the last weeks of his life, understanding exactly what was coming and doing the one thing left in his power to do about it. Moving quietly without telling her, making arrangements to protect her from a threat she did not yet know existed. She thought about the man she had married. She thought about 4 years of a life together, the steady dailiness of it. She thought about the morning she had come downstairs to find him at the table with a map of the eastern pasture spread before him, marking drainage lines she had mentioned worrying about exactly once in passing 3 weeks prior. He had not said he was working on it. He had simply worked on it. That was Owen present in the margins of things, acting on what he noticed without requiring acknowledgement for the noticing. She thought about all the ways she had failed to see that clearly while he was alive, and about all the ways it was becoming clear now that he was gone. She thought about the things he had not told her, the letters in the drawer, the land transactions he had known about for 4 years without acting, the title transfer he had arranged without mentioning it, the letter he had written to River Cord asking him to watch over things. She held both of those realities at the same time, not trying to reduce them into something that fit more comfortably in her chest. A man could be attentive and withholding simultaneously. A man could love you and keep things from you in the same breath, sometimes for reasons that were protective and sometimes for reasons that were simply the habitual privacy of a person who had learned to manage things alone before he learned to share them. Owen had been both things. She was not going to flatten him into either a saint or a failure to make her own grief easier to carry. She reached out and picked up the document and put it in her coat pocket without reading it. "Thank you," she said. She stood. "I will be in touch about the affidavit." She walked out into the cold main street of Harlan's Crossing and stood for a moment with the winter sun on her face and her hand pressed flat against her coat pocket over the folded document. The street carried on around her. A dog trotted past with the purposeful look of a dog that had somewhere specific to be. 2 women came out of the dry goods store talking about something that made them both laugh, the sound bright and brief in the cold air. Clara breathed in the cold and breathed it out, and felt somewhere beneath the grief and the weariness and the slow accumulated weight of the last 4 months, something else, something with an edge to it. Not anger exactly, though anger was present. Something more like the feeling of ground solidifying under her feet after a long time of uncertain footing. She knew what she was facing now. She knew the shape of it clearly. That was she had always found considerably better than not knowing. She went to find River Cord. He was not at the barn when she arrived, which she had half expected. She had come to understand across the 10 days since their first conversation that River Cord's presence followed a logic that was entirely his own, that announcing his whereabouts at all times was not something he considered necessary or particularly wise, and that this was not evasiveness, but simply the habit of a man who had spent a long time in places where being findable was a liability rather than a courtesy. She sat down on the patch of ground where she had found him the first morning and waited, and after perhaps 15 minutes she heard the quality of stillness that preceded his appearance. That particular silence that meant something large and attentive had stopped moving nearby. And then River came around the barn corner and sat down a few feet from her without preamble or explanation. She told him about Tobias. She told him about the title transfer and the letters now locked in the safe and what Tobias had said about the sufficiency of the evidence. She told him about the affidavit and what it would require of him. She laid it out in plain terms without softening any of it, because she had decided that River Cord was a person who deserved plain terms and who would find softening more insulting than honesty. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up a small stone from the ground near his boot and turned it over in his fingers, the gesture that she had come to recognize as his version of the thing other people did with their hands when they were thinking something through. "A county proceeding," he said. "My name on official documents. My face in front of men who will have reached their conclusions about my credibility before I open my mouth." "Yes, all of that." He turned the stone over again. Around them the winter prairie held its particular stillness, the grass standing pale and upright in the cold, the sky the flat white of a sky that was considering whether to produce snow. "I will do it," he said. It was not the answer she had been braced for. She had been prepared for negotiation for conditions for the reasonable reluctance of a man who understood exactly what public testimony would cost him in a place like this. He simply said it plainly, the way he said most things. "You understand what it means," she said. "I understand what it means." He set the stone down. "Owen asked me to look after things. Appearing in front of a county proceeding is looking after things." Clara looked at him. "You are doing this for Owen." River looked back at her. Something in his face very slight, the kind of movement that in another person might have been a smile. "I am doing it because it is the right thing to do, and because Owen asked me to watch over things, and because the man who placed that trap on your porch step should not be permitted to profit from it." He paused. "Those reasons are not in competition with each other." Clara nodded. She looked out at the creek, the thin, dark line of it through the winter grass. "There is something I need to tell you as well," she said. "It affects your calculations about being in this area." She told him about Frank accelerating his timeline. She told him what she suspected about the Omaha lawyer and the 1871 Territory Ordinance. She told him that someone in town was reporting her movements to Frank, which meant Frank knew about her visit to Tobias and possibly about the man at the Willow Creek barn. River listened to all of it with the same steady attention he brought to everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning over what she had said the way he turned over stones. "He is moving faster because of me," River said. "My presence here has accelerated his timeline. Your presence here is also the reason I have 4 years of documented evidence sitting in Tobias Green's safe and a context for understanding what it means," Clara said. "And you found the trap before I found it with my foot. Those things are also true." He looked at her. The winter light was direct and uncomplicated, laying itself across the ground and across his face with the honesty that belonged to winter light, which did not soften or flatter, but simply showed what was there. "My daughter needs me to go to Arizona," he said. "The woman who has been caring for her is ill. There is no one else." Clara heard the layered quality of that sentence, the thing that was in the words and the thing that was underneath the words. She looked at him. "Tell me about her," she said. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she thought he had decided not to answer. Then he said, "Her name is Little Wren. She is 6 years old. She has her mother's eyes, which were the darkest brown I have ever seen so dark. They looked black until the light hit them a certain way. She is quiet, the way that certain children are quiet, not because they have nothing to say, but because they are watching everything carefully before they say it." A pause. "She is already smarter than I am. I noticed that around the time she was 4. Clara looked at her hands on her knees. "Her mother. Fever. 2 years ago. It came on fast." He said it without the particular hollowed-out quality that grief takes on when it has not been processed, but also without the false smoothness of grief that has been deliberately set aside. It was simply the voice of a man who had learned to carry a specific weight and had been carrying it long enough that he no longer noticed it in the ordinary moments, only when someone asked him to set it down and look at it directly. By the time I reached the nearest doctor and came back, it was over. "I'm sorry," Clara said. She meant it without qualification. He nodded once, acknowledgement without performance. After she died, I thought about what to do with little Wren. I could have kept her with me. She is my daughter, and the law, such as it applies to people in my position, would not have prevented it." He looked at the creek. "But I move through places where what I am makes people decide things about the people who are with me. A man alone who is what I am is a problem most people have learned to tolerate by ignoring. A man with a child is a problem people feel they have a responsibility to solve." He paused. "I decided that being near me was less safe for her than being apart from me. And I made that decision, and I have lived with it for 2 years, and I have been sending money every month and visiting when I can come and go without drawing notice to where she is." He stopped speaking. The hawk that had been circling above the creek was gone, and the sky above the creek was empty and white and very large. Clara thought about what it cost to make that decision, to look at a child who needed you and decide that your absence was the most loving thing you could offer. To make that choice not once but every morning, to carry it as both the right thing and the hardest thing, to live in the space between those two descriptions and find no relief in either of them. She thought about the particular quality of his loneliness, which was different from hers. Hers was the loneliness of loss of a space where something had been that was now gone. His was the loneliness of self-imposed distance of a man standing just out of reach of the thing he most wanted because he believed that reaching for it would damage it. Those were different shapes of the same ache, and she recognized them both. "You said you have been wrong about this for 2 years," she said. "What would being less wrong look like?" The question sat in the air between them. He picked up the stone again and turned it over once, twice, a third time. Clara watched his hands and waited. She had come to understand that with River Cord the length of a pause was proportional to the honesty of what followed it. "A situation where her being with me was not the most significant thing about her circumstances," he said finally. "A place where what we are together is one thing among other things, rather than the only thing anyone sees when they look at us." He turned the stone over in his hand one more time and then placed it carefully on the ground. "I have not known how to find that situation. I have told myself it does not exist." Clara looked out at the pale winter grass. She thought about little Wren, 6 years old, her mother's dark eyes sitting with her mother's sister in Arizona territory, waiting for a father who came when he could come without drawing notice to where she was. She thought about what it would mean to that child to have her father nearby. Not the abstract idea of it, the specific daily ordinary fact of a parent present. She thought about her land, her eastern pasture, the cottonwood seedlings Owen had planted along the fence because she had missed trees. She thought about the space that a life contained and the uses that space could be put to. She did not say any of that. It was not the right moment for it, and she was not a woman who spoke before the right moment arrived. "Will you testify?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I will sign the affidavit, and I will testify at whatever proceeding Tobias determines is necessary." He looked at her. "But I need to go to Arizona first. I need to bring little Wren somewhere safe before I put my name into documents that will make Frank Dooley and his Omaha lawyer want to find reasons to discredit me." Clara nodded. That was logical. That was the thinking of a man who planned carefully and protected the things that mattered. "How long?" 6 weeks. Perhaps 8. "Tobias will need your affidavit before you go. He can hold it and file when the time is right. Your physical presence at a hearing, if it comes to that, can be arranged after." She looked at him. "Come to Tobias's office tomorrow morning. I will be there." He nodded. She stood up to leave, and then she stopped, because there was something sitting in the back of her mind that she had been carrying through the whole conversation, and she had learned in 4 months of talking to no one that the things you left unsaid had a way of settling into you permanently if you let them go long enough without air. "You told me the first day that you came back because Owen's letter asked you to watch over things," she said. "And I believe that is true. But I also think a person does not circle a stranger's cabin for 3 nights running on the strength of a dead man's request alone." She looked at him directly. "So tell me the rest of it." River looked at her. The winter light was on his face and there was nowhere to look except back at her, and after a moment he did. "Owen's letter said she is stronger than she knows, and she will figure it out on her own, but if you happen to be in the area, keep an eye on things." He paused. "I was not in the area when I received that letter. I was 200 miles south. I came to this area specifically." Another pause shorter. "A man who travels 200 miles on the strength of a dead friend's request is not doing it only for the dead friend." Clara held that. She let it settle. "You should go see Tobias tomorrow morning," she said. "I will be there at 8. She walked back to the road with the title document in her pocket and River's agreement in her mind, and the particular quality of forward motion that came from knowing for the first time in months exactly what the next 3 days required of her. 3 days later, Nora Dooley came to her door. She arrived at mid-morning on a gray Thursday, leading her horse carrying a covered dish that turned out to hold cornbread still warm from the oven, the steam of it visible for a moment when she lifted the cloth. She was 40 years old and had the face of a woman who had once been more open and had learned incrementally across many years and many small compressions to be less so. Her eyes were attentive in a way that her face had learned to conceal the eyes of a person who notices everything and has decided that noticing is only safe when done quietly. She handed Clara the cornbread and said with the tone of a woman who was accustomed to being admitted, "May I come in?" Clara stepped back from the door. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, because the kitchen table was where truth arrived in Clara's life now, and Nora wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at it for a moment with the expression of a woman gathering herself, and then she looked up. "Frank knows about the man at the Willow Creek barn," she said. No preamble, no softening, stating the fact. "He has known for nearly 2 weeks. Someone in town passes him information when it seems relevant to his interests. I do not know who specifically, though I have my suspicions." She said it without bitterness, the flat recitation of a woman who had long since stopped being surprised by how information moved in a small town. "He also knows about your visit to Tobias Green's office." Nora continued. "He is planning to move faster than he originally intended. He has been in correspondence with a lawyer in Omaha, a man named Aldridge, who specializes in territorial land claims. The specific mechanism Frank intends to use involves an obscure clause in the 1871 Territorial Ordinance about original survey documentation. I do not fully understand the legal architecture of it." She paused. "But I understand that Frank believes he can use it to contest the title transfer regardless of when it was executed." Clara looked at her steadily. "Why are you telling me this?" Nora was quiet for a moment. She looked at her coffee, and then she looked at Clara, and what was in her eyes was the expression of a woman who has been deciding something for a long time and has finally decided it. "I have watched Frank acquire things for 15 years, Nora said. "Land and agreements and advantages and the kind of influence that accumulates in small places when one man controls enough of the mechanisms that other men depend on. I have watched him do this, and I have told myself that he is not a bad man, only an ambitious one, and that the two things are not the same." She set her cup down. "I kept telling myself that until I counted the traps in his equipment shed." Clara went completely still. "I found the missing trap 3 days before it appeared on your porch step," Nora said. Her voice had not changed. It was still flat, still careful, still the voice of a woman who had learned to keep her register even when what she was saying was not even at all. "I counted the set. There was one missing. I recognized which style was missing, and I knew what that style was used for, and I knew Frank had been talking about your property, and I told myself I had made a mistake in my counting." She looked at her hands on the table. "I did not make a mistake." The kitchen was quiet around them. The fire shifted and settled. Outside, the wind moved through the grass with its low, constant, indifferent voice. "He placed a leg-hold trap on the path I use in the dark," Clara said, establishing it plainly, the way you establish something that must be acknowledged before anything else can be said. "He gave the order to a man in his employ," Nora said. "He did not place it himself. Frank does not place things himself. He gives orders, and the orders are carried out, and he maintains a distance from the specific human content of what is done." She paused. That is not a defense. I am not here to defend him. I am here because I found that missing trap in his shed, and I understood for the first time with complete clarity that the space between ambitious and bad is smaller than I had been telling myself. She reached into the pocket of her coat and placed a folded piece of paper on the table between them. That is a copy of the work order Frank signed, directing his equipment man to place a trap on your property. It is dated, it is signed in Frank's hand, and it specifies the location and the purpose. She looked at Clara steadily. I copied it from the original 3 weeks ago. I have been carrying it since then, trying to determine the right thing to do with it. Clara looked at the paper on the table. She did not touch it yet. She looked at it and thought about Nora Dooley carrying this piece of paper in her coat pocket for 3 weeks, going about the ordinary business of her days with this folded document against her ribs, knowing what it meant and what using it would cost her, and not yet ready to pay that cost, and not yet ready to put it down. She thought about the different forms that courage took. She thought about the forms that looked nothing like courage from the outside, that wore the ordinary clothes of a woman bringing cornbread on a Thursday morning, that arrived without announcement and sat down at your kitchen table and placed a piece of paper between you and waited. "You know what this means," Clara said. "If it becomes part of a formal proceeding." "Yes." "Frank will know where it came from." "Yes," Nora said simply. Not a woman who had failed to think this through. A woman who had thought it through entirely and arrived at the other side of it. The two women looked at each other across the table. Clara thought about what Nora had said. The space between ambitious and bad is smaller than I had been telling myself. The particular courage of a woman saying plainly the thing she had been refusing to say to herself for 15 years, saying it not with drama, but with the quiet precision of someone taking an honest inventory. "I have not been brave," Nora said then, not a confession seeking absolution, a statement of fact from a woman who was done with self-deception. "I have been safe. For 15 years I chose safety over honesty, and I told myself they were the same thing, and they are not even close to the same thing." She looked at Clara with eyes that were clear and tired and entirely without self-pity. "You should not make the same mistake." Clara picked up the paper from the table and held it. "Where will you go," she said, "when Frank understands what you have done?" "Agnes Pruitt told me several years ago that her spare room was available if I ever needed somewhere to think," Nora said. She stood and buttoned her coat with deliberate, unhurried movements. "I have been putting off taking her up on it." She looked at Clara one more time, a straight and level look, woman to woman, clear of any pretense. "I believe I have put it off long enough." She walked out the door and led her horse down the road toward town, and Clara stood on the porch and watched her go, and thought about what she had said, and about safety versus honesty, and about the 15 years of distance between those two things, and about all the ways a person could live beside something true and choose every morning not to look at it directly. That evening River Cord came to her door, not to the edge of the property, not circling in the dark. He knocked 3 measured knocks in the early evening with the last of the winter light still pale in the western sky, and Clara opened the door to find him standing on the porch in plain sight, present without qualification, making no attempt to be peripheral. She opened the door wider, and he came in and sat in the chair by the fire that had been Owen's chair, and she put coffee on the stove, and then she sat across from him and put Nora's document on the table and told him everything. He listened the way he always listened, with his full and specific attention, not interrupting, not performing. Concerned, simply taking in what she said with the steady receptiveness of a person who understood that listening was its own form of action. When she finished, he reached across the table and read the work order, reading it twice with the same careful attention he gave everything, and then he set it down. "Tobias needs this tomorrow," he said. "I know. And my affidavit needs to be signed and filed before Dooley's Omaha lawyer can establish standing." He looked at her. "If we move quickly enough, we can remove the legal foundation before Frank has a chance to build on it." "I know." Clara looked at the work order on the table. "Nora took a significant risk to bring this to me." "She did," River said, something in his voice quiet and specific. the recognition of one person who understood the weight of certain choices, acknowledging another person who had made such a choice. They sat with that for a moment. The fire was steady and the cabin was warm, and outside the last light was leaving the sky in the gradual, dignified way of winter sunsets, which did not make a spectacle of themselves but simply diminished by degrees until they were gone. "Tell me about the 1871 ordinance," Clara said. "Do you know it?" "Enough." He leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped. "It was written to address disputed boundaries in the territorial period before proper county survey records were established. It contains a clause that allows a challenge to any title derived from a boundary that was not independently verified at the time of the original territorial survey." He paused. "The northeastern corner of your property was surveyed in reference to the Dooley parcel boundary, which means if Frank can argue that the Dooley boundary itself was improperly established, he can extend that argument to challenge the legitimacy of your corner." "And the letters?" "The letters establish that the Dooley boundary was established through coercion of the original Apache occupants, which means it was improperly established, which means Frank's use of the 1871 clause to challenge your title rests on a foundation he himself corrupted." River looked at her. "He is trying to use the law to accomplish what the law properly applied would prevent him from accomplishing." Clara thought about that. "Tobias will see that." "Tobias will see that," River agreed. "The question is whether a county proceeding will also see it, or whether it will see a mixed-blood witness and a widow and make its decisions accordingly." They looked at each other across the table. "Lyle Pruitt signed a report in 1879 documenting the complaint about the water diversion," Clara said. "Agnes told me. He was deputy at the time. He saw what happened and he wrote it down and then he buried it." River was still. "At some point," Clara said, "a man has to decide who he is. Lyle has been postponing that decision for 4 years. I think Agnes has been waiting with considerable patience for him to make it." She paused. "I think if it comes to a county proceeding, Agnes Pruitt will ensure that her husband makes it." River looked at her for a long moment, and then very slightly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who did not deploy this expression casually, something in his face eased into the shape of something lighter. "Owen said you were more capable than he had words for," River said. Clara felt that land in her chest, the sweet, complicated sting of being seen clearly by a person who was no longer present to do the seeing carried to her by a man who had driven 200 miles on the strength of a dead friend's request. She looked at the fire and let the feeling be what it was without trying to manage it. "He should have told me himself," she said. "Yes," River said. "He should have." The fire settled. The wind outside moved through the eaves with its low and constant voice. They sat with what had been said and did not try to put anything on top of it, and the silence between them was the kind of silence that two people arrive at only when they have said enough true things to each other that silence no longer requires explanation. After a while, Clara poured more coffee. After a while longer, River said, "I will go to Tobias tomorrow morning and sign the affidavit and give him whatever else he needs." He looked at her. "And then I need to go to Arizona and bring my daughter somewhere that is not that spare room of her aunt's house where she has been waiting for 2 years for circumstances to become something they have not yet become." Clara looked at him. She thought about little Wren and her mother's dark eyes and her quiet, watchful quality, and she thought about a 6-year-old child waiting for circumstances to improve and her father waiting for a place that could hold them both without making them into a problem to be solved. She thought about all of it, and she did not say any of it because it was not yet the moment for it, and she was not a woman who spoke before the moment arrived. Instead, she set her cup down and looked at the fire, and River looked at the fire too, and the cabin held them both in its warmth without asking anything of either of them, which was, Clara thought, exactly what a good place did. "Sign the affidavit tomorrow," she said. "Come back when you are ready." He looked at her when she said that. He held the words, and what was underneath the words, with his particular careful attention. Then he stood. He paused at the door with his hand on the latch. He turned back. "I came 200 miles, he said. "I want you to know that I understood when I came that I was not coming only for Owen." He looked at her directly in the way he did everything without evasion or ornamentation. "I am not entirely sure yet what I was coming for, but I am beginning to understand it more clearly." He paused. "I thought you should know that." He went out into the winter dark. Clara stood at the closed door with her hand flat against the wood and the warmth of the fire at her back and the sound of the prairie outside, which was never silent, which always carried in it the sound of wind and water and the distant voices of animals going about their ancient, patient business. She stood there for a while. Then she turned back into the room. She had an affidavit to witness in the morning, and a work order to deliver to a lawyer, and a county proceeding to prepare for, and a great deal of necessary practical important work to do. She sat down at the kitchen table, and she began to make a list. For the first time in 4 months, the making of the list felt not like the maintenance of survival, but like the beginning of something. She was not yet certain what that something was, but she was beginning, like the man who had just walked out her door into the winter dark, to understand it more clearly. The snow came on a Sunday. It arrived without the theatrical build-up that the worst storms announced themselves, with no greenish sky the evening before, no restless behavior from the horses, no drop in temperature dramatic enough to serve as warning. It simply began sometime in the early hours of Monday morning, as a quiet and purposeful accumulation, the kind of snow that did not need to hurry because it had already decided how deep it intended to be by morning. Clara woke to white light through the cabin windows and the particular muffled silence that deep snow produced the world outside, wrapped in something that absorbed sound the way wool absorbed water thoroughly and without residue. She lay still for a moment and listened to that silence and thought about the week ahead with the methodical clarity that had become her primary mode of thinking since Owen died, the habit of a woman who had learned that the only reliable way through difficulty was to see it plainly and move through it one step at a time. River had been gone for 11 days. He had signed the affidavit in Tobias Green's office on a Thursday morning, sitting across the desk from Tobias with the careful attention of a man who understood that what he was putting his name to had weight and intended to give it the full consideration it deserved. Tobias had asked him questions, and River had answered them with the same spare precision that characterized everything he said, giving exactly what was asked for and nothing superfluous. And when it was done, he had looked at Clara across the office and said simply that he would return when he had made arrangements for little Wren's situation. She had nodded. He had gone. In the 11 days since then, 3 things had happened in a sequence that felt in retrospect like the mechanics of a trap closing. The first was that Frank Dooley had called a town meeting. He had framed it as a matter of community safety and civic responsibility, which was the framing a man used when he wanted a room full of people to feel that they were acting from principle rather than at his direction. The meeting was held in the Grange Hall on the Friday after River left, with perhaps 60 people in attendance, which was a substantial fraction of Harlan's Crossing's adult population, and spoke to Frank's ability after 20 years of careful relationship maintenance in this county to make people feel that their presence was both expected and important. Clara had not attended. Agnes had. Agnes's account of the meeting delivered over Clara's kitchen table on the Saturday morning following it was characteristically precise. Frank had begun with a general discussion of property boundaries and the importance of clear title records for the stability of the community as a whole. He had moved from there to a concern about outside influences on local land arrangements, which was a phrase that could mean several things, but in context meant one thing specifically. He had raised the question framed as a question rather than an accusation of whether certain recent events suggested that the widow Marsh's property might benefit from a change in management for her own security and the security of her neighbors. He had not mentioned River by name. He had not needed to. The meeting had not resulted in any formal resolution. It did not need to. What it resulted in was 60 people leaving the Grange Hall with the impression that something about Clara Marsh's situation was irregular and possibly problematic, and that Frank Dooley was a man concerned enough about community welfare to raise the issue publicly. In a town of 340 people, that impression once planted grew without requiring further attention. Agnes had told her all of this with the expression of a woman who had sat through 60 minutes of sophisticated manipulation and was not going to pretend it had been anything else. "He is very good at it," Agnes said. "He has had 20 years of practice." "What did Lyle do?" Clara asked. Agnes was quiet for a moment. "He chaired the meeting as sheriff. He kept order. He did not intervene when Frank made the implications he made." She looked at her coffee. "He came home and ate dinner and did not mention the meeting." Another pause. "He has not mentioned it since." Clara looked at her. Agnes looked back with the expression of a woman who had been married to a man for 31 years and understood him with a completeness that had long since moved past either illusion or bitterness into something more like clear-eyed patience, the patience of a person waiting for someone she loves to become the person she knows they are capable of being. The second thing that had happened was that Mr. Aldridge from Omaha had arrived in Harlan's Crossing. He came on the Tuesday stage, a compact man of 55 with the well-maintained appearance of a lawyer who charged enough to afford good clothes and the careful, contained expression of someone who had learned to show nothing until he had assessed the room. He took a room at the hotel and paid a call on Tobias Green and paid a call on Sheriff Pruitt, and then paid a call on Frank Dooley's house, and by Wednesday morning Tobias had sent a message to Clara telling her that Aldridge had filed a formal notice of title challenge in the county record office. The challenge cited the 1871 territorial ordinance and argued that the northeastern corner of Clara's property could not be properly established without independent verification of the Dooley boundary, which Aldridge argued had never been independently verified. It requested a county hearing within 30 days. Tobias's message had also said, "We have what we need. Do not be alarmed. Come see me Thursday." Clara had gone to see him Thursday. He had shown her what he was preparing, the letters and Rivers' affidavit and the county record of the original survey, and a document she had not known existed, a formal complaint filed with the county office in November of 1879 by a man named Joseph Kesho regarding the diversion of his irrigation water by persons in Frank Dooley's employ. The complaint had been received and logged, and then apparently misplaced in the filing system for 4 years. Tobias had found it when he went looking for it. He had looked for it because Rivers' affidavit had told him it should exist. "Misplaced," Clara said. Tobias looked at her over his desk with the expression of a man who did not traffic in euphemisms but understood their social function. The county record office in 1879 was administered by a man named Peters, who retired in 1881 and now raises cattle outside of Grand Island. I have no way of knowing how a formally received complaint came to be filed in a folder labeled Miscellaneous Survey Amendments. He paused. What I know is that it was received logged with a date and a signature, and is therefore a valid county record regardless of where it subsequently resided. The third thing that had happened was the letter from Roy Becker. Roy Becker was 45 years old and owned the largest farm adjacent to Frank Dooley's holdings on the western side, a man who had benefited from Frank's patronage over many years in ways that had made loyalty to Frank's interests feel like loyalty to his own. He had written to Clara directly in a hand that was labored but legible to inform her that he and several other property owners in the county were prepared to file statements in support of Frank's title challenge, citing their belief that clear and consistent boundary standards were in the interest of all landowners, which was a statement that was technically true and completely dishonest simultaneously. Clara had read the letter twice and then placed it in the drawer with Owen's letters and thought about what it meant to have the weight of accumulated social obligation turned against you, to face not one opponent but the network of relationships that one opponent had spent 20 years building and maintaining precisely for moments like this one. She thought about that on the Monday morning when she woke to snow and white light and the muffled silence of a world that had covered itself overnight in 2 feet of cold. She dressed and built up the fire and made coffee and stood at the kitchen window with the cup in both hands, looking out at the white-covered yard and the white-covered fence line and the white-covered prairie extending beyond it to the white-covered horizon. And she thought about what was coming in the next few weeks and what she had available to meet it. She had Tobias and his careful preparations. She had Rivers' affidavit and the lost complaint and Owen's letters from a man who had written them with precisely this moment in mind. She had Agnes, who was worth 12 ordinary people and who was also, Clara thought, in the middle of a reckoning of her own with the man she had married, and the choices he had made, and the choices he was still making. She thought about Lyle Pruitt chairing that meeting, and keeping order, and coming home and eating dinner, and not mentioning what had happened. She thought about Agnes sitting across from him at that dinner table with everything she knew and everything she was waiting for him to know too, with the patience of a woman who had been waiting 31 years for her husband to become the man she knew he could be. She was still at the window when she heard the horse, a single rider coming from the direction of town, moving through the snow at a pace that suggested purpose rather than urgency. Clara watched until she could make out the rider clearly, and when she could, she set her coffee cup down and went to the door. Agnes Pruitt dismounted with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had been riding in all weather for 30 years, and handed the reins to the post without ceremony, and came up the porch steps with the expression of a woman who had things to say and had not come this far in the cold to be delayed. Clara opened the door before she reached it. Agnes came in and did not take off her coat. That was the first indication that this was not a conversation that intended to be long. "Aldridge filed an emergency motion this morning," Agnes said. "He is requesting that the county judge issue a temporary injunction against any transfer or improvement of the property pending the title hearing. If the judge grants it, you will not be able to do anything with the land for the duration of the legal proceeding, which Aldridge will ensure takes as long as possible." She looked at Clara directly. "Tobias needs to file a counter-response before end of business today, or the judge may grant the motion by default." Clara looked at her. "Tobias knows." "I came to you first." "I was not certain you knew." Agnes paused. "There is something else." Clara waited. "Roy Becker was at Frank's house last night. I know because his horse was tied out front for 2 hours, and Roy Becker does not pay social calls on weekday evenings." Agnes looked at her steadily. "Frank is going to present Roy and at least 2 other landowners as supporting witnesses at the hearing. Men who will say under whatever oath the proceeding requires that they believe the boundary irregularity is real and that resolving it in Frank's favor serves the general interest of property stability in this county." Clara thought about that. "They may believe it genuinely," she said. "Frank is good at making people believe things that serve his interests." "Yes," Agnes said, "he is." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, something that had been held carefully in place, releasing slightly like a held breath, let part way out. "Clara, I need to tell you something that I should have told you sooner and did not, because I was managing my husband's business for him the way I have managed a great deal of his business for 31 years, and I have decided that I am done doing that." Clara looked at her. "Lyle knew about the water diversion in 1879, Agnes said. "Not just the complaint. He saw it himself. He rode out to the Kesho property because Joseph Kesho came to him directly, and he saw the diverted channel with his own eyes, and he went to Frank, and Frank told him it was a maintenance issue that would be corrected, and Lyle accepted that explanation and wrote the complaint into the record as received, and then allowed it to be received into a filing system administered by a man who was in regular receipt of Frank Dooley's goodwill." She said it flatly, without inflection, the voice of a woman reading from an honest document. "Lyle did not fabricate the misplacement. He simply did not prevent it. There is a difference, and it is a small one." The kitchen was very quiet. "Lyle is not a corrupt man," Agnes said. "I want you to understand that I believe that. He is a man who made a choice in 1879 that was easier than the alternative, and then spent 4 years making peace with that choice by telling himself it was a minor matter that the Kesho family had moved on, that no lasting harm had been done, that the integrity of a small administrative decision was not worth the disruption of confronting Frank Dooley's 20 years of goodwill in this county." She paused. "He has been telling himself that for 4 years, and I have been watching him tell himself that, and I have not intervened because I told myself it was his conscience to manage, and not mine." She reached into her coat and placed a piece of paper on the table. Clara looked at it. "That is a copy of the meeting record from November 1879, Agnes said, "a Grange Hall meeting at which Lyle was present as deputy sheriff. The meeting discussed water rights disputes in the county. Joseph Kesho attended and raised the issue of the diversion. The record of the meeting notes his complaint and notes that it was received by the deputy sheriff's office for further investigation." She looked at Clara. "Lyle signed the meeting record. His signature is on that page. It establishes that he was present and that the complaint was formally received, which establishes that the subsequent handling of the complaint was not a matter of administrative error, but a matter of administrative choice." Clara looked at the paper for a long moment. Then she looked up at Agnes. "Lyle gave you this?" she said. Agnes was quiet for one beat. Then Lyle told me where it was. Clara understood the difference. The specific, careful, meaningful difference between a man who had fully chosen and a man who was making his way toward choosing, who had told his wife where the document was and left it to her to decide what to do with it, who had perhaps needed the distance of that indirection to take the step at all. "He knows you brought it here," Clara said. "Yes. And he knows what it means for the hearing." "Yes," Agnes said. "He does." Clara picked up the paper. She looked at Agnes, this woman of 68 years, who had ridden a mile through 2 feet of snow on a Monday morning because she had decided she was done managing her husband's conscience for him, who had spent 31 years being patient and had arrived at the end of her patience not in bitterness, but in the clear-eyed determination of a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and why. "Will he appear at the hearing?" Clara asked. Agnes buttoned her coat. "Ask him yourself," she said. "He will be in his office this morning." She went out the door and mounted her horse and rode back through the snow toward town, and Clara watched her go and felt the specific quality of gratitude that had no adequate expression, the gratitude that came from being helped in ways you had not known to ask for by people who did not require asking. She put on her coat and boots and went to find Sheriff Lyle Pruitt. The sheriff's office in Harlan's Crossing occupied a single room on the north end of the main street, with a wood stove that produced more smoke than heat, and a desk that had accumulated 4 years of Lyle Pruitt's particular approach to paperwork, which was to stack it in categories that made sense to him and no one else. He was sitting at that desk when Clara came through the door, and he looked up with the expression of a man who had been expecting someone and was not certain whether he was ready for them. He was 55 years old and had the face of a man who had been handsome in his youth and had grown into something more weathered and more honest. The vanity of youth replaced by something that was not quite wisdom, but was its precondition. Clara had always thought, the eyes of a man who noticed more than he acted on, which was both his virtue and his central failure. Clara sat down across from his desk without removing her coat. She placed Agnes's copy of the 1879 meeting record on the desk in front of him. He looked at it for a moment. He did not pretend not to know what it was. "Agnes told me she was going to bring it to you," he said. His voice was level and without defensiveness, which told her he had been sitting with this for longer than this morning. "I told her where it was in the records room. I have known where it was for 4 years." "I know," Clara said. He looked at her. "I am going to tell you what I told Agnes last night, which is that I made a choice in 1879 that I believed at the time was a choice between a minor matter of administrative procedure and the disruption of 20 years of community stability, and that I have spent 4 years discovering that this framing was something I constructed for my own comfort and not an accurate description of what I actually chose." He paused. "What I actually chose was to allow a dishonest man to profit from his dishonesty, because confronting him was going to be expensive and complicated, and I told myself the cost was not proportionate to the matter at hand." "And now," Clara said. He looked at the meeting record on his desk. "Now, a woman who has done nothing wrong is facing a legal action built on a foundation I had the ability to expose 4 years ago and did not." He looked up. "The cost of that is considerably less comfortable than I anticipated." "Will you appear at the hearing?" Clara said. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside the office window, the snow-covered main street of Harlan's Crossing carried on its business with the patient continuity of small towns which absorbed individual disruptions and continued regardless. A wagon moved past. 2 men crossed from the hardware store to the hotel, the ordinary world proceeding. "Yes," Lyle said. "I will appear." Clara looked at him. "You understand what that means for your position here. Frank Dooley has been my neighbor for 20 years and has done me a great many favors over those 20 years and will not consider my testimony a reciprocal favor." He said it without irony. "Yes, I understand what it means. Then I will tell Tobias to expect you." She stood. She was at the door when Lyle's voice stopped her. "Mrs. Marsh?" She turned. He was still looking at the meeting record on his desk, not at her. "Owen Marsh came to see me the spring before he died. He told me he was concerned about what Frank might do with the property after he was gone. He asked me to watch out for you." He paused. "I told him I would. I want you to know that I have not forgotten I said that." Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about all the people who had made promises to Owen about her, all the quiet arrangements her husband had made in the margins of his life when he understood his time was running out. The network of small commitments he had built around her like a fence line that she had not known existed until she needed it. She thought about Owen. She let herself feel it without managing it, the grief and the tenderness and the complicated love for a man who had been imperfect and attentive and present and withholding all at once the way most people were when you knew them long enough to see all of it. "Thank you, Lyle," she said. She went out into the snow. The county hearing was set for a Thursday in January, 3 weeks after Aldridge's filing. Tobias submitted his counter-response to the injunction motion within hours of Agnes's visit, and the judge denied the emergency motion 2 days later on the grounds that no irreparable harm had been demonstrated, which Tobias described to Clara as the first small victory in what he expected to be a thorough legal proceeding. In the 2 weeks between the denial and the hearing, Clara did the work that needed doing. She rode to Tobias's office 4 times. She reviewed every document he had prepared and asked questions about the ones she did not fully understand and did not pretend to understand them before she did. She read the 1871 Territorial Ordinance herself, slowly and carefully with a dictionary on the table beside her, and when she had finished, she sat for a long time with the particular satisfaction of understanding something precisely that had previously been only approximately clear. On the 3rd visit, Tobias told her something that changed the calculation about River. "Aldridge has filed a motion to exclude written affidavits as hearsay," Tobias said, setting the motion on the desk between them. "It is not a strong motion, and Judge Hennessy may well deny it. But if he does not, we lose River's account entirely, unless River is present in that room to deliver it in person." He paused. "I need you to reach him before he decides the affidavit was sufficient and stays in Arizona." Clara looked at the motion. She thought about River somewhere on the road between Nebraska and Arizona territory, moving at the pace of a man who believed his part in this was already done. "I will reach him," she said. She also waited for River. She did not call it waiting. She called it conducting her affairs, which she was in fact doing, and the fact that she listened for a horse on the road each evening before she went to bed was simply attentiveness to her surroundings, which was a practical habit and not a feeling. She allowed herself in the evenings by the fire to think about little Wren. She allowed herself to think about what River had said about a place where being together was not the most notable thing about their situation. She thought about the eastern pasture in spring and the cottonwood seedlings along the fence line and the particular quality of the silence in this place, which was the silence of land that did not ask you to justify your presence, but simply received it. She was careful not to build too much on foundations she had not yet confirmed were solid. She was also honest enough with herself to know that when River had said he was beginning to understand more clearly what he had come for, she had understood it too, and that the understanding had not frightened her, which told her something about where she was now compared to where she had been 4 months ago. River Cord arrived on a Wednesday afternoon the day before the hearing with a horse and a pack mule and a child sitting in front of him on the saddle who was looking at everything around her with the dark, watchful eyes that Clara had imagined from his description. Clara was in the yard splitting wood when they came up the road. She heard the horses and looked up and stood with the axe in her hands and watched them come. River dismounted and lifted the child down, and the child stood in the snow and looked at Clara with the focused, unhurried attention of a person who was conducting a careful assessment and was not going to be rushed through it. She was small for 6 and had her father's stillness and her mother's eyes and a quality of self-possession that Clara recognized as the particular composure of a child who had learned early that the world required careful observation. River looked at Clara over the child's head. He looked at her the way he looked at things he considered important, with his full attention and without haste. "This is little Wren," he said. Clara crouched down in the snow so that she was at the child's level. She did not reach out or speak first. She simply looked at her and let the child look back and waited for whatever the child decided to do with the looking. Little Wren studied her for a long moment. Then she reached into the pocket of her coat and took out a small stone, smooth and slightly oval, the kind of stone that rivers make over a long time by the patient application of water to surface. She held it out to Clara. Clara took it. She looked at it in her palm, the weight of it, the particular smoothness of it, and then she looked at little Wren. "Thank you," she said. Little Wren looked at her father. Something passed between them, a small nod from him, something in her face easing by a fraction. River looked at Clara. "She only gives those to people she trusts," he said. He said it quietly, meaning something more than the words. Clara stood up slowly, the stone in her hand. She looked at River. She thought about everything that had led to this moment, the gunshot into the dark, and the disarmed trap on the porch step, and the iron weight of it in her hands, and the walk to Willow Creek, and the conversation outside the barn, and Owen's letters, and Tobias's careful preparations, and Agnes riding through the snow, and Lyle Pruitt saying yes. She thought about all of it as a sequence that had its own logic, not the predetermined logic of fate, but the earned logic of choices made and actions taken, and people deciding one at a time to become the people they were capable of being. She thought about Owen in his last weeks, writing letters and making arrangements, building a fence around her in the only ways still available to him, and she let herself feel the full weight of what he had done and the full weight of what he had not done, and she held both things without resolving them, the way you held things that were true and complicated and permanent. "You are in time for tomorrow," she said to River. "I intended to be," he said. Clara looked at little Wren, who was looking at the cabin with the expression of a child who was deciding something. "There is a room," Clara said. "It has a window that faces east." Little Wren looked up at her. Then she looked at her father. River looked at Clara over his daughter's head. And what was in his face in that moment was not a thing she had the words for, yet something that had come a long way and arrived without fanfare, the way things arrived that were meant to stay. "Come inside," Clara said. "There is coffee, and I have things to tell you about tomorrow." They went inside. The hearing was held in the Grange Hall, the same room where Frank Dooley had held his town meeting 6 weeks before, which Clara noted with the specific awareness of someone who understood that rooms absorbed the events that took place in them and gave them back, changed. County Judge Arthur Hennessy had ridden up from the county seat the night before and was a man of 60 who had presided over enough Nebraska land disputes to have developed a detailed understanding of the ways in which property law could be used both to protect and to dispossess, and who had the weathered patience of someone who intended to hear everything before he decided anything. The room held perhaps 40 people. Clara sat beside Tobias at a table on the left side of the room. Aldridge sat beside Frank Dooley at a table on the right. Frank was dressed with the careful attention to presentation of a man who understood that appearances were part of the argument, and he carried in his posture the confidence of someone who had prepared thoroughly and was accustomed to prevailing. Aldridge was smooth and precise and made his opening statement with the efficiency of a man who charged by the hour and respected his own time. He argued the boundary question, the 1871 ordinance, the insufficiency of the original survey documentation. He presented Roy Becker and 2 other landowners as witnesses to the general principle of boundary consistency. He was, Clara thought, very good at his work. Tobias was better. He presented the letters, first establishing the documented history of Frank Dooley's land acquisition practices with the methodical clarity of someone who had been given 4 years of careful record-keeping by a man who had believed in the importance of written evidence. He presented the recovered complaint from Joseph Kesho, received and logged and signed into the county record in November of 1879, establishing that the water diversion had been formally documented at the time it occurred. Then he called River Cord. Aldridge's motion to exclude the affidavit had been denied 2 days prior, which meant the affidavit stood as written record regardless. But Tobias had told Clara the night before that a living witness in a room was a different thing from a signature on paper, that Aldridge would spend his cross-examination trying to make the paper seem like nothing, and that a man who sat in that chair and answered every question without flinching was considerably harder to make into nothing. The room changed when River walked to the front of it. Clara watched it change, watched the faces of the 40 people present adjust and recalibrate, watched some of them make their decisions about what they were looking at before he had opened his mouth. She watched River notice the room noticing him and proceed without alteration with the same deliberate, unhurried quality he brought to everything, and sit down in the witness chair and look at Tobias and wait. He answered every question precisely and completely, and without embellishment or evasion. He described what he had witnessed in the summer of 1879 with the specific concrete detail of a man who had kept that account in clear memory for 4 years because he had always known it might be necessary. He described the water diversion and the timeline and the effect on the Kesho family's crop and their subsequent position when Frank Dooley made his offer. Aldridge cross-examined him with the particular technique of a lawyer who cannot challenge the substance of testimony, and so challenges the credibility of the witness, questioning his background and his movements and his relationship to the parties involved. River answered each question directly and without defensiveness, offering nothing beyond what was asked, denying nothing that was accurate. Then Tobias called Lyle Pruitt. Frank Dooley turned in his chair when Lyle's name was called. Clara watched Frank's face in the moment he understood what was happening, watched the smooth confidence recalibrate into something more complicated, the expression of a man who had believed he had accounted for all the variables and was discovering he had missed one. The expression was brief and quickly controlled because Frank was good at control, but it was there. Lyle walked to the front of the room with the deliberate step of a man who has made his decision and is walking toward the consequences of it. He sat in the witness chair and folded his hands in his lap and looked at Tobias. He testified about the meeting in November of 1879. He testified about riding out to the Kesho property and seeing the diverted channel. He testified about the complaint being received into the county record. He testified without embellishment and without self-exculpation about his subsequent handling of that complaint and the administrative circumstances under which it had come to reside in a folder labeled Miscellaneous Survey Amendments. He did not offer excuses. He did not minimize. He described what had happened and what he had done and what he had not done with the flat honesty of a man who had decided after 4 years of telling himself a more comfortable story to stop telling it. Aldridge objected twice. Judge Hennessy overruled him twice with the expression of a man who was forming views and did not wish to be interrupted while doing so. In the back of the room, Agnes Pruitt sat with her hands in her lap and her face composed and her eyes on her husband, and when Lyle stepped down from the witness chair and walked back to his seat, he looked at her, and what passed between them in that look was private and complete, and belonged to 31 years of marriage that Clara had no access to and did not need. Tobias made his closing argument with the economy of a man who knew he had already said what needed to be said. The boundary claim Frank Dooley was advancing rested on boundary lines that Dooley himself had established through processes that the county's own records demonstrated were coercive. The 1871 ordinance he was invoking to challenge Clara's title could not be applied to lines whose own integrity was in question. The title transfer Owen Marsh had executed was valid, witnessed and recorded, and there was no legitimate legal basis for the challenge. Judge Hennessy took a recess of 45 minutes. When he came back, he sat down and looked at his notes for a moment, and then looked up. He ruled in Clara's favor. He found that the documentary evidence established a sufficient basis to question the legitimacy of the northeastern boundary lines Frank Dooley was relying on, and that without those lines, the 1871 ordinance claim had no valid foundation. He found that the title transfer executed by Owen Marsh was valid and binding. He dismissed Frank Dooley's challenge with prejudice, which Tobias had explained to Clara beforehand meant it could not be refiled in the same form. He also noted in language that was precise and judicial, and therefore more damning than plain speech, that the handling of the 1879 complaint in the county record office warranted further review by the county commissioners, and that the conduct described in the testimony raised questions about property acquisition practices in this county that extended beyond the present proceeding. He said all of this in a level voice, and then gathered his papers and stood and left the room. Frank Dooley left 30 seconds later. Clara watched him go. He did not look at her. He did not look at Lyle Pruitt, who had walked back to his seat in the front row and was sitting with his hands folded and his eyes forward. Frank walked to the door with the same measured pace he had always walked, with the pace of a man accustomed to owning the rooms he passed through. But the room did not part for him the way rooms had parted for him for 20 years. People stepped aside because he was moving, not because he was Frank Dooley. There was a difference, and the room felt it, even if Frank did not yet. Roy Becker, who had ridden to Frank's house 2 weeks ago and stayed 2 hours and come away believing he was backing the right man, was looking at his boots. Nora was not in the room. She had not been in the room. She was, Clara knew, at Agnes Pruitt's house in the spare room with the south-facing window, beginning the particular slow work of deciding what came next. That work would take time. It would not be easy. But it had begun, which was the part that mattered. Judge Hennessy's note about the county commissioners would reach the right desks by the end of the week. Tobias had told her that quietly on the way in, and she had understood what it meant. Frank Dooley was not finished, not today, perhaps not for months. Men like Frank did not finish quickly, but the record now existed in a form that could not be misplaced in a folder labeled Miscellaneous Survey Amendments. Joseph Kesho's complaint received in November of 1879 was a valid county document. Lyle Pruitt's testimony was a matter of public record. Rivers' account was sworn and filed. The ground under Frank Dooley's 20 years of careful construction had shifted. He would feel it fully later in the way that certain losses announced themselves slowly, the way a fence line looked solid until the day you walked it and found the posts had been rotting underground for a season already. The room was quiet for a moment. Then it was not quiet. Clara sat at the table beside Tobias and felt the noise of the room around her without entirely processing it the way you did not entirely process things that you had been preparing for over a long period. Because the preparation had consumed so much of the available attention that the event itself arrived almost as anticlimax, the body already having spent its tension in advance. She looked at the stone in her hand. She had been holding it through the entire proceeding, little Wren's stone, smooth and oval and slightly warm from her palm. She looked at it and thought about all the things that had led to this moment, and all the people who had played their parts in it, Owen and River and Agnes and Lyle and Nora and Tobias, and a 6-year-old child who gave smooth stones to people she trusted. She thought about all of it, and felt the specific, uncomplicated quality of gratitude that arrived when you understood clearly what you had been given and who had given it. She looked up and found River across the room. He was standing near the door with little Wren beside him, the child's hand in his, both of them watching her. River's face held its characteristic stillness, but underneath the stillness was something else, something that had come a long way and arrived and did not intend to leave. Clara stood up. She crossed the room. She stopped in front of him and looked at him with the same directness she had used from the first morning outside the barn, and she said quietly enough that it was only for him, "You built a room without asking." The corner of his mouth moved. "You said there was space." "I said there was space. I did not say build a room." "I wanted to stay long enough to need one," he said. Clara looked at him. She looked at little Wren, who was looking up at her with those dark, watchful eyes. She crouched down. She placed the smooth oval stone in little Wren's palm and closed the child's fingers around it. "I am going to give this back to you," she said, "so you can hold on to it. For now." Little Wren looked at the stone in her hand, then she looked at Clara. "Can I see the chickens?" she said. It was the first thing the child had said to her. Clara felt it land in her chest with the specific weight of something small and important. "Yes," she said. "I have 3. They are not especially friendly, but they are consistent." Little Wren considered this. "My aunt had a goat that bit everyone," she offered. "That is worse than a chicken," Clara agreed. She stood up and looked at River, and he looked back at her, and the room went on making its noise around them, and it did not matter. They walked out of the Grange Hall into the January afternoon, the 3 of them into the cold, clear air and the white-covered street of Harlan's Crossing and the pale winter sun that was laying itself across the snow with the patient generosity of light that understood it did not need to be warm to be present. River walked beside her. His daughter between them and the town around them made its assessments and its adjustments the way small towns did, absorbing what it could not change, and it did not matter. That evening, after Little Wren had fallen asleep in the room with the east-facing window, Clara and River sat at the kitchen table. Not the first time they had sat at that table, but the first time they had sat there with nothing unresolved between them. No trap to investigate, no affidavit to plan, no hearing to prepare for, no motion to counter. Just the table and the fire, and the 2 of them in the particular quiet of a house where a child was sleeping. River had his hands around his coffee cup. Clara was looking at the fire. Neither of them was in a hurry to fill the space because the space did not feel empty. It felt for the first time like something that belonged to them. After a while, River said, "Little Wren asked me tonight if you were going to be here in the morning." Clara looked at him. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I thought so, that I would ask you." Clara looked back at the fire. Outside, the January wind moved across the prairie with its low, steady voice, the same wind that had been moving across this land since long before either of them arrived on it, and would be moving across it long after. The fire shifted and settled. "Yes," Clara said. "I will be here in the morning." River nodded once. He looked at his coffee. Then he looked at her with the directness he brought to everything, and what was in his face was not a question anymore. "And after that," he said. Clara held his gaze. She thought about the gunshot into the dark on a November night, the first deliberate thing she had done in months, the thing that had started all of this. She thought about how different the dark looked now from how it had looked then. Not less dark, just less empty. "After that," she said, "we figure out what this is." "I know what this is," River said. "I know too," Clara said. "I just wanted to hear you say something first for once." The corner of his mouth moved. It was, she had learned, as close to a full smile as River Cord got in the ordinary run of things, and she had also learned that it was enough. More than enough. They sat by the fire until it burned low, and neither of them moved to add another log, and eventually the coals were all that remained, orange and steady in the dark. And Clara thought that this specific thing this evening, this table, this man across from her, this child sleeping in the next room, was what it felt like when the thing you had been surviving finally became the thing you were living. 3 months later, on a Thursday morning in April, when the cottonwoods were green and the prairie was the particular living gold of spring grass in early light, Clara Marsh and River Cord walked into Tobias Green's office. Tobias had 2 documents on his desk. He had prepared them both with the careful precision he brought to everything, and he set them side by side and looked at the 2 people across the desk from him. Outside the window through the glass, the main street of Harlan's Crossing was conducting its morning business in the unhurried way of a place that had absorbed many changes and expected to absorb more. Tobias pushed the documents across the desk. The first was a property deed. The land. The eastern pasture and the ridge and the cottonwood fence line and the cabin and the room with the east-facing window. The name on the deed was Clara Marsh Cord. The second was a marriage certificate filled in by hand in Tobias's careful small script requiring 2 signatures. River picked up the pen. He looked at Clara. Clara looked at the documents. She looked at River. She thought about a gunshot into the dark on a November night, and a disarmed trap on a porch step, and a stone placed in a child's hand, and a room built without asking by a man who wanted to stay long enough to need one. She thought about Owen briefly, and without grief the way you think about someone who has become part of the ground you stand on, rather than a wound you carry. She thought about what it meant to stay. Not to stay in the sense of remaining in a place, but to stay in the deeper sense, the sense of choosing repeatedly and with intention to remain present in your own life, to remain available to what was true about it, to remain open to what it was becoming, even when what it was becoming was nothing you could have anticipated from where you started. She picked up the pen. She signed her name. River signed beside her. Tobias signed as witness and dated both documents in his precise, unhurried hand and slid them back across the desk and looked at the two of them with the expression of a man who had presided over a great many transactions in his career and understood that this one was different in kind from most of them. "Congratulations," he said. They walked out into the April morning, into the light. Little Wren was sitting on the step outside the office examining a beetle with the focused concentration of a child who found the world endlessly worth investigating. She looked up when they came out and looked at their faces and appeared to reach a satisfactory conclusion about what she saw there. She stood up and took River's hand, and then after a moment, with the deliberateness of a child who did not do things casually, she took Clara's hand as well. The three of them stood in the April light on the main street of Harlan's Crossing, and the town went on around them, and the prairie extended beyond the town in every direction, vast and indifferent and beautiful, the grass moving in the spring wind, the way it had always moved, the way it would always move, remembering everything that had passed through it, and asking nothing in return except to be allowed to remain itself. Clara looked out at it and felt for the first time in a long time exactly where she was. She was here. She was staying. That was enough. That was in fact everything.